The Valori Dominion had conquered 17 star systems across the galaxy, and their empire stretched across distances that most species could not even imagine in their wildest dreams. Their warships were so massive that they could block out entire suns, and their armies numbered in the trillions, spreading fear wherever they went throughout the known universe. Emperor Calthexis the Undying had ruled the Dominion for 4,000 years, and in all that time, he had never once tasted the bitterness of defeat against any enemy. Every species that had faced the Valori war machine had either surrendered within hours or been completely wiped from existence. Their worlds turned to ash and their memories erased from history. On this particular morning, the Emperor's flagship, a vessel called the Eternal Conquest that measured over 50 kilometers in length, emerged from hyperspace above a small blue planet in an unremarkable corner of the Milky Way galaxy. The planet was called Earth by its inhabitants, and the Valori scouts had been watching it for several years, studying its people and their strange ways. What the scouts had reported made the Emperor laugh with amusement and confidence. These humans, as they called themselves, had only recently discovered how to leave their own planet, and their space vessels were slow and primitive compared to even the most basic Valori transport ship. They had no energy shields to protect their cities, no planetary defense grid to repel invaders, and no weapons that could possibly harm a Valori warship hovering in orbit above them. The conquest of Earth would be simple and quick, perhaps taking only an afternoon before the entire planet kneeled before the Dominion's might. Emperor Calthexis gave the order, and Ambassador Zrixtal prepared himself for the sacred duty of delivering the Declaration of Subjugation to the primitive beings below. Zrixtal had served as the Emperor's voice for over 400 years, and he had delivered this same declaration to dozens of species across the galaxy. He knew every word by heart, and he took great pride in watching the fear spread across the faces of those who heard the Dominion's demands for the first time. The teleportation beam activated, and Zrixtal materialized on the surface of Earth, flanked by two massive Valori warriors wearing ceremonial armor that gleamed in the morning sunlight. They had arrived in a place called Ohio, in a quiet suburban neighborhood where small houses lined both sides of a peaceful street. Birds were singing in the trees, and somewhere nearby, a dog was barking at the sudden appearance of the three alien beings. Zrixtal stood over 2 meters tall, his scaled skin shimmering with shades of deep purple and gold, and his 4 eyes scanned the surroundings with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. He unfurled the holographic scroll that contained the formal Declaration of Subjugation, the words written in 14 different galactic languages so that no species could claim they did not understand. On the porch of the nearest house, an elderly human male sat in a wooden rocking chair that creaked gently as it moved back and forth. The human's name was Earl Henderson, and he was 73 years old, a retired factory worker who had lived in this same house for over 40 years. Earl was reading the morning newspaper, holding it up in front of his face as he squinted at the small print through his reading glasses. In his other hand, he held a cup of coffee that was still steaming in the cool morning air, and he took small sips between turning the pages. He had seen the flash of light when the aliens appeared, and he had certainly noticed the massive warship that now hovered above the neighborhood like a dark cloud blocking the sun. But Earl Henderson had lived a long life, and he had seen many things that had tried to scare him over the years. He was not about to let some unexpected visitors ruin his peaceful morning routine. Ambassador Zrixtal cleared his throat, which produced a sound like gravel being crushed, and he began to speak in a voice that shook the windows of every house on the street. "Primitive beings of Earth," he thundered, his words translated instantly by the device around his neck. "The Valori Dominion claims this world and all its resources as property of the Eternal Empire." Earl did not look up from his newspaper. "Your leaders will surrender immediately," Zrixtal continued, his voice echoing across the quiet neighborhood. Or face complete and total destruction at the hands of our mighty fleet. Earl turned the page of his newspaper and took another sip of coffee. "We have conquered 17 star systems," the ambassador declared, his 4 eyes now fixed on the strange human who seemed completely uninterested in his words. "And your world will be the 18th to kneel before Emperor Calthexis the Undying." "Keep it down," Earl said, still not looking up from his paper. "Marge next door is sleeping, and she gets real cranky when someone wakes her up early on a Saturday." Ambassador Drickstall stopped speaking, and his mouth hung open in shock. In 400 years of diplomatic service across dozens of conquered worlds, no creature had ever interrupted the sacred declaration of subjugation. The 2 Valori warriors exchanged confused glances behind their helmets, unsure of what to do in this situation that was not covered in any of their training. Zrixtal looked down at his translation device, wondering if perhaps it had malfunctioned and failed to properly convey the gravity of his words to this primitive creature. But the device showed green lights across all indicators, meaning the translation had been perfect and complete. The human had understood every word, and yet he sat there reading his newspaper as if the most powerful empire in the galaxy had not just declared war on his entire species. "Human," Zrixtal said, his voice now quieter and filled with confusion. "Do you understand what is happening here?" Earl finally lowered his newspaper, just enough to peer over the top at the tall alien standing in his front yard. He looked at Zrixtal for a moment, then glanced up at the massive warship hovering overhead, and then returned his gaze to the ambassador. "Yeah, I heard you," Earl said in a calm voice. "You're here to conquer the planet or whatever. And this does not concern you?" Zrixtal asked, genuinely puzzled by the human's reaction. Earl shrugged his shoulders and lifted his newspaper back up in front of his face. "Son, I've got the Sunday crossword to finish, and my coffee is getting cold," he said. "Whatever you're selling, I'm not interested." The ambassador stood in stunned silence as Earl Henderson returned to his newspaper, completely dismissing the threat of galactic conquest as if it were nothing more than an annoying door-to-door salesman. Aboard the flagship high above, Emperor Calthexis watched the scene unfold through the live feed, and for the first time in 4,000 years, he felt something he did not recognize. It was the beginning of doubt. Ambassador Zrixtal stood frozen in the front yard of Earl Henderson's home, his 4 eyes blinking in complete confusion as he tried to understand what had just happened. In all his centuries of service to the Valori Dominion, he had witnessed many reactions from species facing conquest for the first time. He had seen terror and panic, with creatures running and screaming through their cities as the warships descended from the sky above them. He had seen desperate courage, with warriors charging forward to fight even though they knew they could never win against the Dominion's superior technology. He had seen weeping and begging, with leaders falling to their knees and offering everything they had in exchange for mercy from the Emperor. But never, not once in 400 years, had Zrixtal seen a creature simply ignore him and go back to reading a newspaper. The 2 Valori warriors behind the ambassador shifted nervously in their ceremonial armor, their hands gripping their plasma rifles as they waited for orders. They had been trained to handle combat situations, ambushes, and surprise attacks from desperate enemies who had nothing left to lose. But their training manuals contained nothing about what to do when the enemy simply did not care enough to respond. "Perhaps I should try again," Zrixtal muttered to himself, clearing his throat with that grinding gravel sound once more. He stepped closer to the porch, his heavy boots crushing the flowers that Earl had planted along the walkway just last spring. "Human," Zrixtal said, raising his voice to a level that he hoped would command attention. "I do not think you understand the situation you are in." Earl lowered his newspaper slightly and peered over the top with an expression of mild annoyance on his weathered face. "I understand just fine," Earl replied. You're aliens from space. You have a big ship up there, and you want to take over the planet. Yes, exactly, Zrixtal said, feeling a small spark of hope that the human was finally grasping the seriousness of the moment. So surely you can see why. And I'm telling you, Earl interrupted. I've got a crossword puzzle to finish, and my coffee is getting cold. So whatever you need to do, go ahead and do it, but do it quietly. The ambassador's mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. He turned to look at his warriors, hoping perhaps they might have some suggestion, but they simply stared back at him with the same confusion he felt. Up in orbit, Emperor Calthexis watched the scene through the live feed being transmitted to his command throne, and his clawed hands gripped the armrests so tightly that they began to crack. What is wrong with this creature? The Emperor demanded, his voice echoing through the bridge of the flagship. Is it damaged in some way? Is its mind broken? His chief science advisor, a thin Valori named Desic, who had studied countless alien species, stepped forward with a data tablet in his trembling hands. We have scanned the human, your eternity, Desic reported, and our readings show elevated heart rate and increased stress hormones in his blood. Then he does feel fear, the Emperor exclaimed. He knows the danger he faces. That is what confuses us, your eternity, Desic admitted. The human's body shows all the signs of recognizing a threat, but his behavior suggests complete indifference to that threat. The Emperor leaned forward on his throne, his ancient eyes narrowing as he studied the image of Earl Henderson on the view screen. Scan the area, he commanded. Perhaps there is something protecting him, some hidden weapon or shield we have not detected. The science team worked frantically at their stations, running every scan they could think of on the small house and the human sitting on its porch. Nothing, your eternity, Desic finally reported. We detect no weapons, no shields, no protective technology of any kind. The human is completely defenseless. Down on the surface, Ambassador Zrixtal decided to try a different approach. He would demonstrate the power of the Dominion directly, showing this stubborn creature exactly what he was dealing with. Human, you clearly do not grasp the might of the Valori Dominion, Zrixtal said, pulling out a small device from his belt. Let me show you something that might help you understand. He pressed a button on the device, and a holographic display appeared in the air between him and the porch. The display showed images of past conquest cities burning, armies fleeing in terror, entire civilizations reduced to rubble under the bombardment of Valori warships. We have destroyed civilizations that were ancient when your species was still living in caves, Zrixtal declared. We have wiped out empires that stretched across 100 worlds, and we have crushed every enemy who dared to stand against us. Earl glanced at the holographic display, watching the images of destruction and devastation for about 3 seconds before returning his attention to his newspaper. That's nice, he said in a flat voice. Zrixtal felt his purple scales flush darker with frustration, a sign of anger among his people that would normally send subordinates running for cover. Our armies number in the trillions. He shouted, we have weapons that can crack planets in half, ships that can survive flying through the heart of a star, warriors who have trained for combat since before they could walk. Earl turned the page of his newspaper. He murmured, clearly not paying attention. We are the most powerful force in the entire galaxy. Zrixtal bellowed, his 4 eyes bulging with disbelief at the human's continued indifference. Every species we have ever encountered has fallen before us. Earl looked up again, but this time he was squinting past the ambassador at the massive warship still hovering above the neighborhood. Hey, could you move that thing? Earl asked, pointing at the ship with his coffee cup. It's blocking my sunlight, and I just planted tomatoes in the backyard last week. They need the sun to grow properly. Ambassador Zrixtal stood completely still, unable to process what he had just heard. This human, this fragile creature made of soft flesh and weak bones, had just complained about tomatoes while facing the might of the greatest military force in galactic history. The two Valori warriors looked at each other behind their helmets, and one of them whispered, "What is a tomato? And why does he care more about it than about us?" Up on the flagship, Emperor Calthexis slowly rose from his throne, his 4,000 years of experience telling him that something was very wrong with this situation. "Your Eternity," his chief advisor said quietly, "perhaps we should study these humans more carefully before proceeding with the invasion. Their behavior is unlike anything we have ever encountered." The Emperor stood in silence for a long moment, watching the view screen as Earl Henderson calmly drank his coffee and ignored the ambassadors' increasingly desperate attempts to get his attention. "Yes," the Emperor finally said, "I think that would be wise. There is something about these creatures that we do not understand. And I have not survived 4,000 years by rushing into situations blindly." He turned to his staff, his expression troubled in a way that none of them had ever seen before. "Find out everything you can about these humans," he ordered. "I want to know what makes them so different from every other species we have conquered." And so the investigation began, and what the Valori discovered would shake them to their very core. The research team aboard the Valori flagship worked without rest for 3 full days, gathering every piece of information they could find about the humans of Earth. They intercepted television broadcasts and radio signals, downloaded the entire contents of the human internet, and translated thousands of years of recorded history from every culture on the planet. What they discovered made them wish they had never started looking. Emperor Calthexis had summoned his top advisors to the Grand Strategy Room, a massive chamber decorated with trophies from 17 conquered star systems. The walls were lined with flags from defeated empires, weapons taken from fallen warriors, and holographic displays showing the planets that now belonged to the Dominion. But today, no one was looking at those trophies. Instead, all eyes were fixed on the lead researcher, a scholar named Vexinar, who had spent 3 centuries studying alien civilizations. Vexinar's scales had turned a pale shade of gray, which among the Valori was a sign of deep fear and distress. His hands trembled as he activated the holographic display in the center of the room, and his voice shook as he began his report. "Your Eternity," Vexinar said, "I must warn you that what I am about to share is extremely disturbing. I have studied hundreds of species across the galaxy, and I have never encountered anything like these humans." The Emperor waved his hand impatiently. "Get on with it. Scholar, what did you discover?" Vexinar took a deep breath and began to speak. "The humans have only recently achieved space travel, as we already knew. But what we did not know is that they have been waging war against each other for their entire existence as a species." "That is not unusual," one of the admirals said with a dismissive wave. "Many primitive species fight among themselves before we arrive to bring them order." "You misunderstand," Vexinar replied, his voice growing higher with anxiety. "When I say their entire existence, I mean every single generation for thousands upon thousands of years. They have never stopped fighting, not even for a moment." The room fell silent as the scholar continued. "The Valori Dominion expands through conquest approximately once every few centuries," Vexinar explained. "But humans wage war constantly, simultaneously, across their entire planet at any given moment in their history. There are multiple conflicts happening in different regions." He pulled up a timeline showing human wars, and the display was so crowded with conflicts that it looked like a solid red line stretching across thousands of years. "Surely they must pause to recover between wars?" an advisor asked. "No," Vexinar said, shaking his head slowly. "They fight and rebuild at the same time. Their capacity for violence is matched only by their capacity for recovery." Emperor Calthexis leaned forward on his throne, his ancient eyes studying the data with growing unease. "Show me their weapons," he commanded. Vexinar's scales turned even paler as he switched to a new display, This is where the situation becomes truly alarming, Your Eternity. The hologram showed images of mushroom clouds rising over cities, devastation spreading for miles in every direction, and radiation poisoning the land for generations. Approximately 80 years ago by their calendar, Vexinar explained, the humans developed weapons capable of destroying entire cities in a single blast. They call them nuclear weapons. Impressive for a primitive species, an admiral admitted. That is not the disturbing part, Vexinar continued. The disturbing part is that they use these weapons on themselves, twice on populated cities filled with their own kind. Gasps of horror echoed through the strategy room. They deliberately killed hundreds of thousands of their own people with these weapons? The Emperor asked, disbelief clear in his voice. Yes, Your Eternity. And it was not a mistake or an accident. It was a calculated military decision that they still debate and discuss today. The scholar paused to let this information sink in before continuing. After that, they did not stop developing these weapons instead. They made them even more powerful, 10,000 times more destructive, and they built thousands of them. For defense against us? Someone asked hopefully. No. Your Eternity. They built these weapons to point at each other for 50 years. They kept enough nuclear weapons aimed at themselves to destroy their own planet several times over. Admiral Dexrol, who had led the Valori fleet for 800 years, spoke up with confusion in his voice. Why would any species threaten to destroy itself? That makes no sense. They called it deterrence, Vexinar explained. They believed that the threat of total destruction would prevent anyone from actually using the weapons. That is insane, the Admiral declared. Yes, Vexinar agreed. And yet it worked. They lived under that threat for decades and somehow considered it normal. The Emperor raised his hand to stop the murmuring that had broken out among his advisors. What else did you find? He demanded. Vexinar switched to a new set of images, showing humans engaged in various activities that made no sense to the Valori observers. Beyond their wars, the humans engage in behaviors that suggest they have no regard for their own survival, the scholar said. The display showed humans climbing frozen mountains where the air was too thin to breathe. They climb these peaks, knowing that many of them will die in the attempt, and they do it for no practical purpose. They call it a challenge. Another image showed humans diving deep into the ocean, where the pressure would crush any Valori. They explore the depths of their seas in tiny vessels, knowing that any failure means certain death. The next image showed humans jumping from aircraft with nothing but fabric to slow their fall. They leap from flying machines for entertainment, trusting their lives to simple cloth and strings. Then came images that truly shocked the Valori observers. Humans fighting large animals with their bare hands, running through streets while angry bulls chased them, and eating food so spicy that they caused physical pain. They do all of this voluntarily, Your Eternity, Vexinar said. They call it fun. Emperor Calthexis stared at the display in silence for a long moment. And there is one more thing, Vexinar added, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. There is a phenomenon among humans called Florida Man. What is Florida Man? The Emperor asked. We do not fully understand it, Your Eternity, but based on our research, Florida Man appears to be a human subspecies that is immune to fear, common sense, and possibly the laws of nature itself. The reports from this region are beyond anything we can explain. The scholar showed headlines from something called news reports, and even the translation software seemed to struggle with what it was reading. Humans fighting alligators with their hands, humans driving vehicles into impossible situations, humans doing things that should not be physically possible. The Emperor sat back on his throne and looked around at his advisors, seeing his own concern reflected in their faces. These creatures, he said slowly, are not like anything we have faced before. No, Your Eternity, Vexinar agreed. They are something entirely different. and I recommend extreme caution in how we proceed." But the Emperor had not conquered 17 star systems by being cautious, and his pride would not allow him to retreat without at least testing these strange humans. "We will show them our power," he declared, "and then we will see how they respond." It was a decision he would soon come to regret. Emperor Calthexis had made his decision, and nothing his advisors said could change his mind. The humans needed to understand what they were dealing with, and a simple demonstration of Valori firepower would surely accomplish that goal. He ordered a single Devastator-class warship to move into position over a remote island in the Pacific Ocean, far from any human settlements. The island was small and uninhabited, covered with trees and surrounded by blue water that sparkled in the sunlight. It would serve as the perfect target to show these strange humans exactly what the Dominion's weapons could do. "Fire when ready," the Emperor commanded from his throne aboard the flagship. The Devastator-class warship powered up its main weapon, a plasma cannon capable of vaporizing mountains and turning oceans into steam. A beam of blinding white energy shot down from the sky, striking the island with the force of 1,000 bombs. The explosion was visible from space, a mushroom cloud of fire and debris rising high into the atmosphere. When the smoke cleared, the island was gone, not damaged or destroyed, but simply gone, as if it had never existed at all. Where once there had been land, now there was only water and floating ash. Human satellites captured the event, and within minutes, the footage was spreading across their global communication network. Emperor Calthexis watched and waited, expecting to see panic in the streets and governments rushing to surrender. Surely now the humans would understand that resistance was impossible. But the response that came was nothing like what he had anticipated. The Valori communication arrays, which had been monitoring human broadcasts, suddenly began receiving millions of messages from individual humans all over the planet. The translation software worked overtime trying to process the flood of communications. "That was so cool. Do it again." "Can you hit my neighbor's house next? He plays loud music every night." "Fake. This is obviously computer graphics. You can see the pixels." "Finally, aliens are real. I knew it all along. My friends called me crazy." "Hey aliens, are you hiring? I hate my job and would love to work on a spaceship." And most disturbing of all, "Welcome to Earth. You have alerted the Horde." Emperor Calthexis stared at the view screen in complete disbelief. He had just destroyed an entire island with a weapon that had made other species surrender immediately, and the humans were treating it like entertainment. "What is wrong with these creatures?" he demanded, slamming his fist against his throne. His chief advisor stepped forward nervously. "Your Eternity, we are detecting unusual movement patterns across the planet. The humans appear to be traveling toward our landing sites." "They are evacuating?" the Emperor asked hopefully. "No, Your Eternity, they are arriving. They appear to be coming to see us." The view screen switched to show the area around the Ohio neighborhood, where Ambassadors Rickstall had first made contact. Cars and trucks were filling the streets, and people were getting out with devices in their hands that the Valori did not understand. "Those devices," the Emperor said, pointing at the screen, "are they weapons?" "We believe they are called phones, Your Eternity. They are communication devices with cameras built in." The humans were taking pictures and recording videos, laughing and pointing at the Valori warriors who stood guard near their landing shuttle. Some humans had brought food and were setting up chairs, treating the whole thing like some kind of festival. Others were holding signs with messages written on them. Some welcomed the aliens. Some demanded to be taken to other planets, and a few offered to sell the aliens something called real estate. "They are not afraid," Admiral Lex Rahl observed, his voice filled with confusion. "They are treating this like a celebration." Then the Admiral noticed something else, and his scales turned pale. "Your Eternity, some of these humans appear to be armed with projectile weapons." Indeed, scattered among the crowd were humans carrying rifles and handguns, weapons that used chemical explosions to launch small pieces of metal at high speeds. By Valar standards, these weapons were primitive and should pose no threat to their advanced armor. But the way the humans carried them, with casual confidence and obvious familiarity, suggested something troubling. "Have any of them fired on our forces?" the Emperor asked. "No, Your Eternity. They appear to be waiting." "Waiting for what?" The Admiral did not have an answer. Meanwhile, aboard the flagship, intelligence officers were trying to make sense of the human response. "Your Eternity," one officer reported, "we have intercepted communications from the humans' military forces. They are mobilizing." "Excellent," the Emperor said. "Now we will see their true strength." But as the data came in, the officer's face grew more troubled. "Your Eternity, their military forces are not preparing defensive positions. They appear to be arguing about who gets to attack first." "That makes no sense," the Emperor said. "We have a fleet that could glass their entire planet. Why would they want to attack?" "I do not know, Your Eternity, but we are detecting very high levels of enthusiasm in their communications. Words like excited, finally, and it's about time appear frequently." Another officer spoke up with even more disturbing news. "Your Eternity, we have detected a problem with our invasion plans." "What problem?" "Our ground forces were designed for ceremonial occupation, not actual combat in the past. Species have always surrendered after orbital bombardment, so we have never needed to fight on the surface." The Emperor's eyes widened as he understood what the officer was saying. "You mean we have no soldiers trained for ground combat?" "We have soldiers, Your Eternity, but they are trained for parades and guard duty, not for fighting enemies who shoot back." Admiral Lexroll pulled up tactical data on his display. "Our analysis indicates that while human weapons cannot harm our warships, they would be extremely effective against our ground troops. Their projectile weapons can penetrate standard infantry armor at close range. Then we will bomb them from orbit," the Emperor declared. "We could, Your Eternity, but our scholars believe this would not achieve surrender based on their history. The humans would simply rebuild and continue fighting." The Admiral paused, his voice dropping lower. "There is also the matter of their nuclear weapons. Your Eternity, we have confirmed that they still possess thousands of them, and we do not know what they might do if pushed too far." "They would not use nuclear weapons on their own planet," the Emperor said with a dismissive wave. "With respect to Eternity, they already have twice." The room fell silent as the weight of that statement hung in the air. Finally, one of the younger advisors spoke up, his voice trembling. "Your Eternity, I must share something else we discovered in our research." "What is it?" "The humans have a concept called mutual assured destruction. If they believe they cannot win, they may choose to ensure that no one wins." "You mean they would destroy themselves just to destroy us?" "Based on their history and psychology, Your Eternity, we believe they would consider it an acceptable outcome." Emperor Calfexis sat in silence, his 4,000 years of experience telling him that he had finally encountered something he did not know how to defeat. These humans were not cowards who would surrender to superior firepower. They were not rational beings who would calculate the odds and accept defeat. They were something else entirely, something that made his ancient blood run cold. "Recall Ambassadors Rixdal," the Emperor finally said. "I need to think about this." For the first time in 4 millennia, the Emperor was afraid. 3 days had passed as the Valori Dominion first appeared above Earth, and everything had changed. The massive warships that had blocked out the sun were now retreating to the edge of the solar system, their weapons powered down and their invasion plans abandoned. The declaration of subjugation had been quietly deleted from official records, and Emperor Calfexis had ordered a complete review of Dominion strategy regarding the human species. Nobody spoke of conquest anymore now. They only spoke of caution and avoidance. Ambassador Zrixtel had requested one final meeting with the human who had started all of this confusion. The elderly man named Earl Henderson, who had refused to look up from his newspaper. The Emperor had granted this request, hoping that perhaps Zrixtel could learn something useful that would help the Dominion understand these impossible creatures. On a quiet Saturday morning, much like the one where this all began, Zrixtel teleported down to the same suburban street in Ohio. This time, he came alone, without warriors or ceremonial armor, wearing simple robes that marked him as a civilian rather than a representative of military might. Earl Henderson was exactly where he had been before, sitting on his porch in his rocking chair, reading the newspaper and drinking coffee. The morning sun was shining down on his little house, no longer blocked by alien warships, and his tomato plants were getting all the light they needed. Zrixtel walked up the path to the porch, carefully stepping around the flowers this time, and stopped at the bottom of the steps. "Human," he said, his voice quiet and tired. "May I speak with you?" Earl lowered his newspaper and looked at the alien standing in his yard. Something had changed about the creature. The pride and arrogance were gone, replaced by something that looked almost like respect. "Pull up a chair," Earl said, gesturing to an empty seat beside him. "You look like you could use some rest." Zrixtel climbed the porch steps and sat down heavily in the offered chair, his four eyes gazing out at the peaceful neighborhood. "We are leaving your world," the ambassador said. "The fleet is already withdrawing." "I figured as much," Earl replied. "The news has been going crazy about it." They sat in silence for a moment, the only sound being the gentle creaking of Earl's rocking chair and the singing of birds in the nearby trees. "I must understand something," Zrixtel finally said, turning to look at Earl with genuine confusion in his eyes. "When we first arrived, you knew who we were and what we intended. You understood the threat we represented." "I did," Earl agreed. "Then why were you not afraid?" The ambassador asked. "Every species we have ever encountered has shown fear when faced with the Dominion's power. But you simply read your newspaper as if nothing was happening." Earl set down his paper and turned to face the alien fully, giving him his complete attention for the first time since they had met. "Son, let me tell you something about humans," Earl said, his voice calm and steady. "We are not a species that scares easy." He reached for his thermos and poured himself another cup of coffee before continuing. "I was born in 1953, right in the middle of something called the Cold War. Do you know what that was?" "We researched it," Zrixtel admitted. "Both sides of your planet pointed nuclear weapons at each other for decades." "That's right," Earl said. "I grew up doing drills in school where we hid under our desks and waited for bombs that never came. I learned to live with the threat of total destruction before I was old enough to drive a car." He took a long sip of his coffee, his eyes distant with memory. "When I was 18, they sent me to fight in a war on the other side of the world. I saw things there that would give your warriors nightmares. And I learned that death can come for you at any moment, no matter how careful you are." Zrixtel listened in silence, beginning to understand something important. "I came home, got married, raised 4 kids, buried my wife, and kept on going," Earl continued. "I survived recessions that took everything I had worked for, illnesses that nearly killed me, and a divorce that made me want to give up on life." He turned to look directly at the ambassador, his old eyes sharp and clear. "I have spent 73 years on this planet, facing one crisis after another, and you know what I learned?" "What did you learn?" Zrixtel asked. "That the universe is too big and too unpredictable to waste time on fear," Earl said. "You can spend your whole life being afraid of what might happen. Or you can drink your coffee, read your paper, and deal with problems when they actually show up." The ambassador sat back in his chair, processing these words. "But we could have killed you," he said. "We could have destroyed your entire planet." "Maybe," Earl agreed. "The worrying about it wasn't going to stop you, was it? The only thing I could control was whether I let you ruin my morning." He chuckled softly and shook his head. "Besides, I knew something you didn't." "What was that?" "That if you actually tried to take this planet, you'd be in for the fight of your life," Earl said, his voice dropping to a more serious tone. "We humans are too stubborn to know when we're beaten, too crazy to care about the odds, and too mean to die easy." He pointed a finger at the alien beside him. "You want this planet, you better bring more than one fleet, and even then, we'll make it cost you in ways you can't imagine." Zrixdale was quiet for a long moment, considering everything he had heard. "Your species," he finally said, "is absolutely insane." "Probably," Earl agreed with a grin. "But we've made it this far, haven't we?" The ambassador let out a sound that might have been a laugh. "I suppose you have," he admitted. "Against all odds and all reason, you have survived and thrived." He stood up from his chair and looked down at the old man who had single-handedly convinced an empire to retreat. "I do not know if we will ever return to your world," Zrixdale said, "but I will remember this conversation for the rest of my life." "Well, if you ever do come back," Earl said, picking up his newspaper again, "try knocking on the door first. It's more polite." The ambassador nodded and walked down the porch steps, pausing at the bottom to look back. "Thank you for the conversation, Earl Henderson." "Any time," Earl replied. "And hey, Zrixdale?" "Yes? You want a cup of coffee before you go?" The ambassador considered the offer for a moment, then smiled, a strange expression on his alien face, but genuine. "Perhaps another time," he said. "I must report to my emperor." And with a flash of light, he was gone. Earl Henderson returned to his newspaper, turning to the crossword puzzle section that he had been working on for days. 7 across had been giving him trouble, but as he looked at the clue again, the answer suddenly seemed obvious. The clue read, "What keeps humans going against all odds?" Earl smiled and filled in the letters. "Perseverance." High above the Earth, the Valori fleet engaged their hyperdrives and vanished into the darkness of space. In the official records of the Dominion, Earth was reclassified from primitive target to category Omega avoid at all costs. The reason given was environmental hazards, but everyone who had been there knew the truth. And in the Valori military handbook, a new entry was added that would be studied by officers for generations to come. It reads simply, "Under no circumstances engage the humans in ground combat, they enjoy it." Earl finished his crossword that afternoon and went inside to water his tomato plants. The universe had tried to interrupt his morning, and he had simply refused to let it. That was the human way, always had been, always would be. And somewhere in the vast darkness of space, an ancient emperor sat on his throne and wondered how such small creatures could be so impossibly, wonderfully, terrifyingly stubborn. He never did find an answer.